Hey, it's Bill. I'm in the purple room. Wanted to do a little bit of a whiteboard talk and then go out in the gym, but there was a question about how I go about utilizing and coaching a rear foot elevated split squat or Bulgarian split squat, depending on whatever term you want to use, doesn't really matter. It's just another split squat variation with a few bells and whistles attached to it that manipulates some of the factors as to how it creates load at certain joints and how it influences some muscle recruitment. So I just want to talk you through that a little bit first, and then we'll go out in the gym, and I've got a little special guest out there who's going to volunteer to do some demos for us. So if we look at the position of the rear foot elevated split squat or Bulgarian split squat, we've got the back foot up on a bench and we've got the front foot placement here. And the biggest difference between the rear foot elevated versus any other split squat variation is how much load gets shifted towards the front side leg. So in a normal split squat, we can actually manipulate the load from front leg to back leg quite a bit, from about 45 to 55%, I think, from front to back, or I'm sorry, back to front. And if you look at, say, a forward lunge, then it's going to be about a 75% load, I think, towards the front leg. And with the rear foot elevated, I think we can actually elevate that front leg load up to about 85% if memory serves. So that's the biggest difference, is that we're shifting load towards the front leg by bringing the back leg up. A couple of other concerns that we may have is actually the step length. So how far away from the bench are we going to try to set this up? And what we find is that the further away from the bench, the more load I shift towards that knee moment, because I get a little bit more knee flexion. I get a little bit of a change in the tibial angle. So if I want to make sure that I'm loading more of the hip structures, I'm going to use a shorter step length relative to the bench. And so when we're talking about loading the hip, so we're going to see higher glute medius activity, we're going to see more hamstring activity and less quad activity. So the emphasis remains towards the hip. Again, if I elongate that step, I'm going to start to shift the moment towards the knee. I still don't think it's going to even approximate what we would do in, say, like a bilateral squat as far as quad load goes. But because we're shifting the moment towards the knee, we should see a little bit more load on the quad there, and maybe a little bit less on the hip. Another big concern that I want to point out in regards to the back leg position, one of the factors involved here is that we can have a more upright torso in this position relative to a bilateral squat, which reduces some of the loading at L5-S1, and there's some indications that that's the case. Maybe there's an element of safety there, maybe not. I'm not gonna go there, because I think that if we say that one position is safer, there's other things to be concerned about. So when we talk about hip mobility and the ability to extend the hip behind the body, we have to be concerned that at some point in time, the relative flexibility of that hip is going to come into play. And so if I extend the leg out, I may actually have more demand on trying to gain extension in the hip. Well, that's going to allow the pelvis to move a little bit differently. Especially in the sagittal plane, which actually may increase my lumbar lordosis, and now we're talking about different types of loads. I'm also going to see a shift in the transverse plane. So in the longer step length, as I step forward, the pelvis is actually going to turn away from that front leg, and so now I'm going to have an externally rotated position in the front hip and an internally rotated position in the back hip, at least to some extent. And again, as that step length increases, depending on that individual's relative flexibility, we're going to see any number of presentations. But as I do this, if I'm keeping shoulders square relative to the front of the body, but I've got a pelvis that's actually turned to the left, now I have spinal rotation under load. And I also have a sacral position that is twisted between the two ilia. So I have to take that into consideration as well. So whereas maybe I do have a reduced load at L5-S1, I may be actually loading other structures such as a sacroiliac joint structure or the joint itself. Or maybe I'm placing too much demand on a hip joint. Maybe I don't have the mobility available to me to perform this exercise, so I'm going to have some sort of compensatory activity that I have to take into consideration. That one may increase injury risk, but again, that's always a tough one to measure because we just don't know. We're not good at predicting injury or estimating risk under these circumstances because we have load, we have position, we have tempos, we have relative flexibility, we have flexibility that changes depending on how much stress we're applying via load and environment. So we have to take all of these things into consideration when we're talking about this rear foot elevated split squat. So you have to make some choices as to what your intent is. You have to make choices as to the individual that's actually performing the exercise before we go out on a limb and say, well, this is better, this is not better. I think as long as we have an intent, we are progressing. So this might be a nice transitional activity if I'm going to go from a double leg supported split stance activity like a split squat or a lunge or a back lunge, if I'm going to try to transition into any sort of single leg activity because of the emphasis on the front leg, because of the load and the recruitment patterns are approaching some of the similarities to actually a single leg activity. So this might allow us to manage pressures inside of our body a little bit more effectively, control the position of the pelvis in the frontal plane, a little bit more transverse plane control and demand as a transition to get us to a single leg activity if that's the intent.